Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. Welcome to FPTV new releases and our special 12 Days of Halloween event with our special guest today, the awesome Jonathan Sims. Good to see you, mate.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you so much for joining us. Laura is a big fan of your novel. Let's see, what's that titled? 13 Stories. And we've got an awesome book plate edition at Forbidden Planet that we're linking to off this interview. So if you follow the links from this interview, you can go directly and order your copy from us. Laura, I know you're a huge fan, so do you want to get going with the questions?
Yes, yeah, of course. So without too many spoilers for everyone watching, what can you tell us about 13 Stories?
It's essentially a haunted house story, but it centers around a tower block called Banyan Court, which is sort of starkly divided. It was built by a now horrifically murdered billionaire called Tobias Fell. And under various, there are various legislations that say if you build luxury housing, you have to sort of apportion off a part of it as affordable. But often this is like lower quality or kind of shunted to the side or slightly ghettoized. And so this story it's in many ways sort of almost semi-anthology. Because each chapter is following a different person with a connection to this building, either who lives there or who works there. Some from the rich luxury side, some from the poorer side, and each of them finding these strange and sinister echoes within the building that speak to both its past and the past of the person who built it.
Wow, okay.
Very interesting.
Does this
Very
kind of
interesting.
draw on any of your own experiences? Like, have you lived in like a haunted flat share before?
I've lived in my fair share of, shall we say, affordable accommodation. And it's very much a London novel. It draws so much on this experience of being here, where all these different histories, both of the place and all these sort of other histories that and sort of almost atrocities that that Britain and London has sort of expanded out to encompass, all sort of brought into this one condensed mass of humanity. And so that's very much the sort of the feeling, that sort of horrific social, but it is quite a traditional haunted house story, or like almost a traditional Gothic story, in the sense of it being all about the old unresolved crimes and the horrors that have never been reckoned with, but set in this very this modern sort of urban environment.
That actually sounds fantastic. And could you get into us for a bit what kind of influences that you've had upon this novel in particular?
Upon this novel, so my earliest sort of horror influence is very much the old sort of British ghost stories, M.R. James, Algernon Blackwood, all those, even some of Charles Dickens, that sort of out of the corner of your eye, growing, creeping dread sort of thing. But I'm also a massive fan of sort of online creepypasta, and this very emergent sort of internet horror story, which is much more to do with the like direct, inexplicable, taking the world that is incredibly mundane and inserting something that is out and out horrific, that sort of derails it, and sometimes without any actual explanation. So like I very much try to merge that sort of immediate visceral nature with the sort of the classic old British horror story. And also for 13 Stories specifically, I think there's quite a lot of like Ramsey Campbell, Clive Barker, that sort of urban that sense of the city as a living and sometimes hostile place.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to me to be a fairly extended metaphor for life in the 20th century, right? 21st century. I mean, this is the world we're living in, actually.
Yeah, I mean, this is like 13 Stories very much like tries to grapple with and explore a lot of those, a lot of those social themes. It's, it is a book that is, I think, very concerned with where we're at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think M.R. James married to Ramsey Campbell, married to Clive Barker. That's a very potent combination to me.
I hope so.
Yeah, it certainly speaks to me. And have I got this right? Are you a comic book fan?
I am. So my father collected old Marvel comics, so I very much grew up on like old X-Men and Avengers and this sort of thing. And I remember whenever he used to go up to London, I'd always sort of tag along and like just follow him around all the West End comic shops. And indeed, Forbidden Planet, as was before the Shaftesbury Avenue store. So I've very much grown up with that medium. Sorry, I'm just trying to. I've gone completely blank on.
That looked like one of those spectacular reverie cues that people have. Where if life was like a Simpsons episode, it would literally have been a thought balloon next to your head. That was the aspect you adopted them for a second. That.
I was very much. I was about to be like, oh yeah, I'm reading a lot of really good comics at the moment, and then my mind went completely blank because I'll be honest, since lockdown, I've mainly been falling into TV shows and video games in lockdown.
Yeah.
But previous, I've been getting very into a lot of sort of Junji Ito and various of the horror mangas.
Yeah, Junji Ito is a spectacular piece of work, actually.
Absolutely wonderful, and very much. I think a lot of the storytelling style in 13 Stories is actually not dissimilar to how he works in things like Uzumaki, where each individual chapter works as its own sort of standalone horror story, but they all sort of interlink and build on each other. Also, I've been revisiting old Hellblazers because I am a massive fan of the old, like the early run where there's that incredibly strong vein of like working class British anger.
Yeah, is that I suspect that's the early Jamie Delano run has got a lot of that.
Back when you have explicitly Thatcherite demons.
Yeah, a lot of class war. There's the there's the city vampires and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. That's very strong. Have you ever read the Garth Ennis run on Hellblazer?
I have. Garth Ennis is a comic book writer who I love everything he does the first time I read it, and then every time I revisit it, it feels like I'm seeing the themes a bit more. Specifically, like rereading a lot of Garth Ennis's run of John Constantine, for me, his John Constantine is too cool, if that makes sense. He's too somebody you'd want to be. Whereas like Jamie Delano's run has always felt so much more like this is somebody on the fringes who is there because there's nowhere really else he can go.
I think that is such an interesting observation. It's very similar to a point of view I've heard before. There's a guy's a friend of mine. He's called Peter Hogan, and he used to be the author on the Books of Magic, and he's written a bunch of Constantine, and he's worked in those kind of gaming and Alan Moore universes quite a bit. He's got his own thing called Resident Alien, but I've heard him express. I personally am a big fan of Constantine. But I've heard him say almost exactly the same thing as you, which is, kind of, here's the thing about Constantine. Garth Constantine has mates that he meets in the pub, and he's got this kind of social network. John Constantine, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't have any mates. He's the ultimate disaffected loner who can't really get on with anybody.
Well, like in the early ones, he has friends, but they are also like marginalized on the fringes. Even though like it's not made canonical that John Constantine, even though it's not made canonical, he's bisexual until somewhere in the 50s. Like you read all those early ones, all his friends are like in the sort of like the queer subculture or or the drug subculture, or like they're all on the fringes. So right from the start, it's very much tapped into this feeling of like outsiderness. Whereas I find Garth Ennis's run is much more like the elements of London and like British culture that he's more interested in tapping into are like gangsters or your sort of Cray twin mob sort of style stuff, as opposed to the early ones, which are much more like weird old Aleister Crowley style British folk magic.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting observation. And given how you've just taken us through that.
Sorry, I'm meant to be talking about 13 Stories, but I'm like, here's my thoughts on John Constantine Hellblazer.
It's fascinating because hearing people, talk about other people's work always informs their own work and your take on that work. So it's very interesting to, I haven't heard you say that. Could you give us a flavour of the Magnus Archives and what that is all about, please?
Oh, yeah. So the Magnus Archives is sort of how I got started in horror. It is a audio drama. Well, it's an anthology narrative audio drama horror thing. The central conceit is that there is a new head archivist at the Magnus Institute, which is a London-based institute dedicated to researching the weird supernatural stuff. And the central format is that each episode he is taking a statement that someone has given from some time in the Institute's history and committing it to tape. So individually, each episode is a sort of standalone first-person horror story with some, at the end, some sort of context from the archivist, who I very foolishly named after myself, because when we got started, it was like, oh yeah, it's going to be like kind of anthology. It'll be like a host thing, like the Crypt Keeper. But it very quickly turned into this huge, because the statements are all part of a single world, and they gradually start to link together, and certain characters from them begin to recur, and you sort of and eventually spill over. We are currently in the 5th and final season, and a lot of stuff has gone down. And as it went on, Jonathan Sims, the archivist, became an incredibly distinct and incredibly different character to myself. So now I see a lot of fan art of Jonathan Sims, and I'm like, yeah, that's very Jonathan Sims, the archivist, Johnny Sims, the writer.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it's been a really fascinating, a really cool ride, because it started out throughout it, I feel like I very much found my own feet as a horror writer. When it started, it was much more on the sort of the creepypasta. Here's a scary story. That's kind of it, sort of side of things. Whereas now I feel like I've developed my craft enough to get to some similar to sort of 13 Stories. It's evolved into actually talking much more about social issues or grappling with questions of ethics. Not to get to up myself about it, but I think it's going pretty well.
That's good. I mean, these things are very important. Yeah, Laura.
Yeah, I think as well, horror in general tends to be tied in a lot to kind of social commentary, so that completely makes sense that those kind of go hand in hand. So.
Absolutely. I mean, horrors are the things that scare us are social. What we as a society fear is always evolving alongside the society in which we live, and that's why a lot of older ghost or horror stories, they're interesting and sometimes fascinating, but they don't necessarily get us in the same way because they're not playing on those same fears. Horror has a tendency to punch down into other, especially with things like mental illness, for instance.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is because like what's the fears that society has built are generally built off the fears of those in positions of power. So like I'm very keen to try and engage in a sort of horror that avoids sort of punching down or like taking that sort of either like mental illness or that sort of Lovecraft style racism where like the darkness is all imported from like elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting listening to you talk about that. I mean, somebody who works hard to be cheerful on the outside, but wakes up every day with an almost crippling sense of overwhelming existential dread. When I then talk to somebody like you, whose job it is to put that down on paper, it's always fascinating to see the things that compel you, the aspects of horror that speak to you, and what it is you feel compelled to write about.
Well, it is interesting. Like I think at a very fundamental level, if you're not writing your horror about something that also scares you, you're probably not going to nail it. Because if you don't have that slightly tight chest, that slight like tingle of fear in the back of your head when you're actually writing it, I think it's hard to pinpoint where that fear is. So I think horror's a weird one in when I say like, oh, write what you know. And it's like, well, you might not know like long, slender-limbed things that climb in your window and just hollow you out and wear you, but you do know that might be something you're afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, you've brilliantly strayed into Laura's ongoing sort of linchpin question for this arc of interviews, which I'll let Laura ask.
Yes, so we're asking all the authors taking part in 12 Days of Halloween, what scares them the most?
Death, I think. At the core, like death is the thing that sits under everything as this central dread. Because there's that certainty, there's that inevitability about it that means that it's hard to dwell too minutely on for a long time before it gets you. Aside from that, I am.
But excuse me, mate, that was a spectacular answer. Just because you really sucked me in with that. As you went from beginning to middle of the end in that one, I was like, yeah, man, that's heavy stuff, and it really is, But it's everything, isn't it? Existence and the extinguishing of existence and what that actually means. I think it's such a compelling thing to think about and be haunted by.
Yeah. Also the scale, if that makes sense. The trying to conceptualize something larger than your mind can really grapple, because we always like, you can look at a picture of planet Earth and be like, oh yeah, that's planet Earth. But if you actually try to conceive of how big that actually is, your mind doesn't want to. And there are certain sort of, occasionally I'll stumble across a piece of art, for instance, that'll use a trick of scale to actually make your brain register just how big something is. And that always sends a very pleasing shiver through me.
Yeah, I can feel that. Something funny enough that's the chord that struck within me is something I've always been scared of is scale, is size. So the idea of happening upon massive sculptures or structures, because when you look at those, I think, well, if that's there, what actually built it, right? It's like I always found Christ the Redeemer very scary, to be honest. if that makes sense.
Or there's that there's one, I always forget its name, but it's a warrior statue in China, I believe, and it's absolutely colossal. It just sort of towers over everything, and yeah, like it's one of these things where as soon as you actually see it, you're like, oh yeah, that's a good statue, and then you'll see this like tiny visitor center, and you're like, oh wow, okay.
Yeah. Right on. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think somebody you touched upon before that I think what Lovecraft was particularly good at doing when he wasn't being, a crazy bananas racist, it is absolutely that the implication that there is something out there to be feared and that can fill you with dread that is much, much bigger than you can conceive of. And that unnamed horror and unnamed sense of dread is so vast and overwhelming as to be not explainable to a human mind. And which is why it can never go away, which is why it haunts you, because you can't get your head. The vastness of it is just implied, and it can't be measured.
Yeah, the Magnus Archives certainly very much, I feel, is part of that, or at least in conversation with that sort of cosmic horror tradition.
Yeah.
13 Stories, by comparison, is, I think, a bit more grounded. It's a bit more centered on, like, as I say, your a modern classic ghost story. But certainly, like, that sort of cosmic horror is something that draws me a lot, and which I'm pretty sure I will return to.
Excellent. I can't wait, actually, mate. We're getting full tilt boogie into the end of our time together. So Laura, do you have one more question for Jonny?
I do. So you mentioned before about computer games. I know you developed some tabletop games. Is that correct?
Yes. Myself and my partner, we run a small tabletop RPG publisher called McGuffin Company.
Great name.
At the moment,
fantastic.
Thank you. What we're mainly doing at the moment are micro settings. So what these are system neutral settings for tabletop or online role playing. The idea being that most sort of campaigns for your D&D or your Unknown Armies, they're huge. They're these vast worlds that are assuming that you're going to be doing sort of 2-year-long campaigns. So what we've had a lot of fun doing is doing short sort of micro campaigns, which are they take a very so for instance, Not Far to Bermuda is all set on a cruise ship that's been in the Bermuda Triangle for about 300 days, and they're each these very sort of small, sort of self-contained little settings with sort of a core campaign of about 4 adventures and then a bunch of like adventure seeds. And it's because I really like to play a lot of different RPGs, and I want something a bit meatier than just a one shot, but at the same time, especially over the last year or two, getting people together for like the full epic start to finish campaign is less and less feasible. We also do we have various free little games as well. So if you want to check that out, it's McGuffinandCompany.com.
McGuffinandCompany.com. That's brilliant, mate. Thank you. So this has been FPTV. This has been FPTV 12 Days of Halloween with the fascinating Jonathan Sims talking about 13 Stories and the amazing sounding Magnus Archive. Thanks for talking us through that, mate. That was a really great chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really good.